All right, we're going to talk about chapter 3, Colonial America Amid Global Change. Another big chunk of time in this chapter, 1680 to 1754. Talk about why 1754 is important in a little bit, maybe in the next video. But let's hop to it. All right. So if you will recall, kind of towards the end of chapter 2, it's talking about wars in Old and New England. So across the pond, across the Atlantic, some stuff was happening. So if you'll remember, Charles the First, he was executed and Parliament established a Republican Commonwealth. And that's when Oliver Cromwell rose to prominence. He was a Puritan and he emerged as the leader of the Protestant parliamentary. And once Charles the First was executed, Cromwell takes over and he rules England as a military dictator until his death in about 1658. By then, much of England had tried, well, they were tired, of religious conflict and Puritan rule. So Charles the First's son, Charles the Second, he was invited to return from exile and to restore the monarchy and the Church of England. And in 1660, when he ascends the throne, the Puritans are going to recognize that their only hope for building a godly republic is going to lay in North America. But after Charles II took the throne, both Connecticut and Rhode Island were granted charters that allowed them to maintain some local autonomy. Charles II used other colonies to repay his debts to his supporters by granting them land in North America and giving them positions on the councils of trade and plantations and partnerships in the Royal African Company. His brother, James, the Duke of York, was given control of New York. If you will recall, that was formerly a Dutch possession that was known as New Netherland. Remember, the English were going to take that from the Dutch. William Penn Jr., he establishes Pennsylvania. And that was originally established, he kind of pulls a one over, but it's established as a refuge for his fellow Quakers. I believe we've talked a little bit about William Penn. He's supposed to set it up as a certain kind of colony, and then he kind of changes it, makes it for Quakers. That's okay, it's supposed to be for Catholics. But between 1660 and 1685, English aristocrats established proprietary colonies all the way from Carolina all the way to New York. Most of the proprietors sought to create a highly structured society that was based on English manorial system. So you have your English manor with your lord and kind of everyone that falls under that. And so we're kind of seeing that playing out here in the New World as well. In Northern Carolina, less affluent settlers really forced the proprietors to lower land prices and guarantee some governmental rights. English West Indian planters, they tried to recreate a Barbados in Southern Carolina by importing Africans as slaves, creating these large plantations, and establishing a trade relationship with the West Indies. Pennsylvania's early government guaranteed religious freedom for Christians, not just the Quakers, but for all Christians, and also allowed all land-owning men to vote and hold office. William Penn, allegedly, this is where I don't agree with the book so much. It says that he established good relations with the local Indians and attracting thousands of settlers. That is true. Thousands of settlers were attracted to Pennsylvania. But that good relationship, it wasn't necessarily an even relationship between William Penn and Native Americans there. I want you to kind of keep that in mind. Sometimes the wording of treaties that were signed were not always explained in full detail to Native Americans, and they couldn't always read the language that it was being written in. So it looks like a good relationship was established, but at the same time, Native Americans were sometimes being duped with these treaties. James II, he is going to succeed Charles to the throne, and he's more authoritarian than his brother. And what James does is he consolidated the northeastern colonies, he banned town meetings, challenged original colonial charters, and imposed new taxes. Not cool, James. He's overthrown in 1688 in what is known as the Glorious Revolution. And the Glorious Revolution, it's called glorious because there's no bloodshed. They don't kill James, they don't execute him. He's just removed from the throne, and it's not like this huge bloody revolution like we're going to see with the American Revolution and later on with the French Revolution. Instead, William of Orange and his wife Mary, the Protestant daughter of James II, they became joint rulers and introduced more democracy after this glorious revolution. This is also at a time when John Locke is writing, and he wrote in support of the changes, challenging and arguing that government depended on the consent of the governed. Contractual agreement is what your government should look like. In 1692, William and Mary granted a charter for the new colony of Massachusetts, in which Plymouth and Maine were joined with Massachusetts Bay. While the charter restored town meetings and an elected assembly and expanded voting and office holding rights to all property owners, not just to Puritans, it also gave the crown the right to appoint a royal governor and custom officials. So kind of giving some autonomy back to the colonists, but also making sure like those higher up positions are held by like the royally appointed. So keep that in the back of your mind. Maryland was also assigned a royal governor, and the Church of England became the established religion there. In New York, the new royal governor created a representative assembly and supported a board of aldermen that was dominated by wealthy English merchants. William and Mary started royal authority, but tried to create a partnership between colonial elites and the crown by supporting these long-standing local institutions. With the founding of Georgia in 1732, she's our last original of the 13 colonies, if you will, and the most southern of the 13 colonies. England had 13 North American colonies, a number that would be maintained until the start of the American Revolution. Let's switch over and talk about Spain really quickly and what's going on in the northern provinces and kind of out in the south and the southwest. So their authority was dangerously thin in its northern provinces. Tensions worsened between the Spanish and the Pueblos in New Mexico as drought and disease prompted the Pueblos to reject Catholicism and return to their native traditions. In response, Spanish officials hanged 3 Indian leaders and punished numerous others, and among them is going to emerge a leader by the name of Pope. Pope led 17,000 Pueblo Indians in a broad-based revolt that began on August 10th, 1680. In coordinated attacks, they attacked forts, destroyed farms, desecrated churches, and they drove the Spanish out of New Mexico. The Spanish were able to reconquer parts of New Mexico about 10 years later in 1690 because of Apache raids and internal conflicts among the Pueblos. And by 1696, the Spanish had regained control of the province. To prevent another revolt from occurring, Franciscan missionaries established better relations with the Pueblos by allowing them to retain more native practices, trying to mix Christianity with the native Indian tradition. The Pueblo Revolt limited Spanish expansion by strengthening other American Indian groups. So the Pueblo refugees, they taught the Navajos to grow corn, raise sheep, and ride horses. The Navajos passed that knowledge to the Comanches and others. The Comanches built a vast trading and hunting network based on the availability of horses. And in Taos, New Mexico, where Spanish control was weak, the Comanches sold slaves and traded for horses and weapons. Spain sought to solidify its presence in Texas to counteract French claims to Louisiana. In the early 18th century, missions and forts appeared from Texas all along to the present-day Louisiana border, all up and down that border. Because the Apache and the Caddo were powerful Indian nations, Texas's Spanish residents adopted many native practices and customs just to avoid that conflict. In Florida, the Indians worked to undermine the spread of cattle ranching. English traders encouraged Indian trade, and some groups ended up moving north. Anglo-Spanish tensions along the border eventually will explode into war. I'm going to pause there. We're going to talk about France for just a second. What's going on with France? James II, he really modeled himself after the French king, Louis XIV. Both rulers believed in the divine right of kings, but Louis was more successful in maintaining his authority. France extended its empire more through trade and exploration than through settlement. In 1682, Cavalier traveled down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico and claimed the territory of Louisiana for France, but he failed to establish a permanent colony. Seeking a southern outlet for furs, French settlers established settlements along Louisiana's Gulf Coast and 2 forts are established at Biloxi and Mobile Bays. The small outposts, they survived in spite of this internal and some external conflicts. There's epidemics and lack of support from France. Still, by 1715, Louisiana tallied only 300 French settlers. Okay, so now we're going to kind of switch over and talk about some of these internal and external conflicts that are happening and how that's going to kind of trickle over across the Atlantic from Europe into the Americas. Louis XIV of France, he wanted supremacy in Europe, and he's going to build this large professional army. The French army came to seem invincible after securing victories over its nearest neighbors. King William's War, this happens between 1689 and 1697, was the first sustained war waged by France and England in North America. I want you to take note of that. This is like the first European war that takes place in America. It's the first sustained war. Conflict in Europe, it spread to North America with attacks on French and Huron settlements around Montreal and northern New York. Although the war ended kind of in a virtual draw, many colonists who served in the English army died of wounds, disease, and starvation. Those who did survive, they really resented what they thought was an unnecessary loss of life. The Indian fur trade was also devastated, and in 1701, the Iroquois agreed to remain neutral in all future European conflicts. In the War of Spanish Succession, this is between 1702 and 1713. It's also known as Queen Anne's War. England fought against both France and Spain, each of which hoped for additional territory in North America. This is all fought because there was no apparent heir to the Spanish throne. Go back and read in your book more about that. I guarantee that's probably one of the questions you're going to see on the quiz. The treaty that ended the war was intended to establish a very long-term peace, but England gained the most. Having incorporated Scotland into Great Britain in the 1707 Act of Union, England claimed Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the Hudson Bay Territory from France. It also gained St. Kitts, Gibraltar, and Minorca from Spain. England also obtained the right to sell slaves in Spain's North American colonies. Rather than creating a lasting peace, though, the Treaty of Utrecht led to all 3 European nations strengthening fortifications along their colonial borders. Native peoples struggled to remain autonomous. Some allied with Europeans to improve their trading position, but the threat of colonial expansion empowered male warriors in societies in which older women had traditionally held significant power. Conflicts began to divide Indian groups along generational and gender lines. In the late 17th century, guns began increasing tensions in and between Indian tribes. Slaves became the most valuable commodity for Indians to trade, especially in the southern region, increasing conflict between tribes. Some southern tribes tried to create a pan-Indian alliance similar to that formed in the 1670s by Indians in New England. A group of Tuscaroras attacked North Carolina settlers in 1711 with the hope that other local tribes would join in. Instead, South Carolina rallied the support of the Yamasees among other tribes and defeated the Tuscaroras by 1713. The Tuscaroras forfeited their land in the south and moved north, becoming part of the Iroquois Confederacy. The Yamasee War erupted shortly thereafter in 1715, and the Yamasee people, deeply in debt to the British, allied with the Creeks and the Cherokees in the most serious Indian war in the colonies. Only after the Cherokees changed their allegiance were the British able to secure victory and impose somewhat fragile peace. The Yamasee War transformed native North America. The Creek and Catawba tribes built independent confederations. The Cherokees allied with the British. The Creek and the Caddo tribes sided with the French. Despite the British victory in war, colonists in the backcountry of the southern, middle Atlantic, and New England colonies suffered periodic raids and met fierce resistance as they moved westward into Indian Territory. Likewise, Native Americans who were displaced from their traditional lands came into conflict with those tribes further west. All of this conflict only helped fuel the growth of the Indian slave trade on the western frontier as the French and the Spanish continued to compete for that dominance. I just want you to take note of these 3 major empires, European empires in North America. I also want you to take note of where these major Indian tribes are as well. And as you can see, there's not really a whole lot of Indian tribes in the English colonies area. That's because if you'll remember, they've been pushed towards the Appalachian Mountains and over the Appalachian Mountains in some instances. As more European settlers and these Anglos are coming in, they're pushing those Indians off of their tribal lands. So if you'll notice, the British really stick here close to the Atlantic seaboard. You have the Spanish down here holding onto Florida, but also moving into the southwest. And then along the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes, all the way into what we consider Canada today, you have the French. Let's talk about some conflicts on that southern frontier. By 1720, many British colonists were convinced that British proprietors really didn't care about the colony's welfare. Given that the British Army, how they treated colonial militias, and Parliament's unwillingness to help in stopping Indian attacks, kind of seemed like they didn't care. A growing number of new immigrants to the colonies were not from Britain, and thus they were not reflexively loyal to the British authority. In 1732, remember Georgia, that's our last colony that was established. It's really established as a buffer between South Carolina's profitable plantations and Spanish Florida. Georgia is set up as a convict colony, trying to reform convicts. So yeah, kind of like Australia. Spanish authorities were furious about this, being that buffer zone. In 1739, they captured an English ship captain who was trading illegally in the West Indies, and they cut his ear off. British forces attacked St. Augustine and Cartagena, but they were repulsed. An invasion of Georgia by Spanish troops in 1742 also failed, and once again an American conflict had become part of a broader European war in which the Spanish and the French allied against the British and the Germans. The war ended in 1748 with British supremacy over Georgia, but it was a huge cost. Many colonists wondered if British and American interests were still compatible. Southern Indians were also embroiled in these ongoing disputes, particularly along the lower Mississippi Valley and in Texas. And the French had trade relations with the Caddo and the Choctaw, and the Spanish had to overcome a bitter history and agreed to stop kidnapping and enslaving Apache women and children in order to achieve a powerful alliance. The British needed the support of the Germans, the Scot-Irish, the Swiss, and the Protestant French immigrants to secure the frontier. Germans and Scots settled in the backcountry of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia at mid-century. Other immigrants settled along the inland waterways of South Carolina. So this is kind of like a benefit of empires when colonial traders join these global networks. European consumers really shape the kind of goods available in the rest of the world. And African slaves as commodities and as producers of other commodities enabled Britain to participate fully in the global market. The global trade increased and diversified in the early 18th century. Goods were flowing not only between Europe, Africa, and Asia and the colonies, but also among the colonies themselves, north and south, up and down the seaboard. New Englanders supplied fish to the Caribbean and the Carolinas, and rum, molasses, slaves, and ship stores flowed back. The growth of coffee houses and the port cities of North America was crucial to expanding credit and trade as merchants and sea captains exchanged information there. Newspapers in Britain and America contained news of stock prices, politics, and economic disasters, such as the South Seas bubble. Some imperial policies that really focus on profits, one of those is mercantilism. In the late 17th century, mercantilism became the favored economic system in England and France. And that is mercantilism. It's centered on establishing a favorable balance of trade by exporting more than importing. And France's finance minister, he taxed foreign imports to encourage trade between France's colonies, which produced raw materials, and then the home country, which used those materials to manufacture goods for sale abroad. England benefited more fully from mercantilism because England had access to a greater supply of natural resources and a larger market for its goods. So the Navigation Act, that enhanced the mercantile system by enacting controls on colonial trade. So for example, certain enumerated articles could only be exported to England, and certain imported items had to be carried on English ships or ships with mostly English crews. In 1663, Parliament required that all goods going to the colonies from Europe had to stop in England first. Then, starting in 1673, England sent custom officials to America, and English ports flourished as goods from America and goods going to the colonies competed for space on the docks. Parliament tried to protect Britain's domestic manufacturing by forbidding the colonies from manufacturing textiles, hats, iron goods, and others that they were doing back in England, and it even tried to regulate trade between the colonies. By 1750, 75% of manufacturing trade between Great Britain and North America and 95% of that trade with the West Indies, that was all controlled by North American merchants. Getting wealthy. Although mercantilism was expected to benefit Great Britain, it created this mercantile elite in the colonies. At the time, this next subtopic, the Atlantic slave trade, it really seemed like a benefit to the empire, but you could argue that, but also at what cost? It's going to cost someone else. The Royal African Company, it was chartered in 1672 as England came to take a greater role in the Atlantic slave trade. 40% of all slaves sold in the Americas between 1700 and 1808 were carried on British ships and colonial ships. Although many captive Africans died in transit or in Africa itself, the Africans brought to America transformed labor in the colonies. They became an important element of international trade and made fortunes for their owners. African merchants and European traders built the slave trade, trading slaves for commodities such as guns and metalware. At the beginning of the slave trade, most slaves were prisoners of war, but as the trade grew, more and more men, women, and children were captured purely for the transatlantic trade. Over time, the trade moved further inland, devastating West Africa, particularly the Congo-Angola region. The Middle Passage. That's the passage across the Atlantic. It was horrific, and it was an often deadly experience for Africans. Slaves were chained below decks with insufficient food and water, and women were often victims of sexual abuse. That's not to say that men weren't either, just more than often it happened to women. Moreover, the slaves spoke different languages, so none of them knew exactly where they were going or what was going to happen to them because they couldn't even communicate with each other. Surviving slaves went through what's known as a seasoning process, a period of acculturation. And that happened in the West Indies. So they were brought over from Africa. They went through the seasoning process in the West Indies before they were either taken into North America or into South America. Many slaves, they don't survive. They fell victim to disease. Some of them even attempted suicide and were successful. Others adapted even as they resisted enslavement. Just want to give you a visual here about the rise and decline of slave trade. If you look there at the bottom, those are the years, and they've done a good job of telling you the colonial years. You'll notice after colonial years, 1776 when we declare independence, that's when the South is really going to take hold of slavery and rely more. In 1808, we allegedly stop the importation of slaves and rely on natural increase, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But you can see it starts off very slow, right? Not a whole lot of slaves coming in. And then all of a sudden, there's this huge uptick during the colonial years, and it reaches kind of a peak right after colonial years, the slave trade. And then you'll notice there's that decline as we're approaching the Civil War. Also, the destination of slaves. You'll notice, and this is a pretty somewhat accurate, 3.6 arrive in mainland North America. Again, we're going to rely a lot on natural increase, but also that isn't 100% accurate because we know that slaves were traded on the black market. That figure there showing that Brazil got the majority of slaves, that is somewhat accurate. Most slaves do end up going to South America, more than they do mainland North America and mainland Spanish America. What the slave trade does, it turned the colonial seaports into these metropolitan centers where inhabitants spent really lavishly on homes and consumer goods. Although those cities contained less than 10% of the colonial population, they were centers of commercial, political, and cultural activity. Because wealth could be made easily in North America, concepts of status really began to change in the 18th century. Status was increasingly tied more to economic success and like this genteel lifestyle than to your family's pedigree, whether you were a member of the royal elite or the royal family or not. It really doesn't matter in America. We don't have a royal family. Benjamin Franklin was an example of social mobility in the 18th century. After years as an apprentice for his brother's paper, the New England Courant, Franklin eventually landed in Philadelphia, and in 1729 he became the printer of the Pennsylvania Gazette. Colonial elites delighted in conspicuous consumption and built large homes, emulating those of the British gentry. They also supported public building projects and infrastructure development to enhance trade and leisure. The success of the international trade created these deep class divisions, and in addition to merchants, artisans, and small shopkeepers, colonial cities contained a growing number of unskilled laborers, unemployed, and enslaved. Their frequent wars contributed to these divisions, increasing the profits of merchants in the upper class. In contrast, the aftermath of these conflicts brought rising prices, falling wages, and a lack of employment for the lower classes. Let's talk about some different labor in North America and finding work in the colonies. Unemployed laborers didn't necessarily find jobs even as the demand for labor increased. Many employers preferred indentured servants, or slaves. Laborers had to match their skills with the demand. And we have this one story, you can read about him in the chapter. But workers such as William Morley found themselves at the mercy of economic forces when they competed or they completed their indentured contract. And if you will recall from previous chapters, like indentured servitude, that was really the preferred method of servitude in the colonies. But slavery is going to begin to replace indentured servitude throughout the South and also in some parts of the North. Other laborers competed for a shrinking pool of positions as master craftsmen took on fewer apprentices in order to maintain the value of the trade. The redemptioner became a new form of bound labor in North America. Shipping agents offered would-be immigrants passage to the colonies on the conditions that passengers would find an employer who would repay the cost of the passage. This system was particularly popular among German immigrants who hoped to become independent farmers in Pennsylvania. Hundreds of convicts also came to America each year and were indentured to American employers. As late as 1750, the majority of white workers were bound servants. Slaves were a small percentage of the total northern population, except in New York, where white workers competed with slaves for jobs as dock workers, seamen, blacksmiths, and household servants. Just to give you a visual of servants versus slaves. And you can see in the 1660s, like in servants, was preferred. And then right here about 1690, we're going to see indentured servitude kind of falling down and slaves increasing. While white bound laborers may have felt some commonality with slaves, they knew eventually they would be free. Many immigrants hoped to become landowners or independent business owners, and for bound laborers, that was a possibility, not for slaves. Former indentured servants, they do have to compete with bound laborers and other free laborers for jobs. There were land shortages in many areas, and even well-established landowners saw their economic prospects declining. As the colonial population grew in the 18th century, more people competed for land and jobs, and many jobless laborers migrated from town to town looking for work and doing whatever odd jobs they could find. Seasonal work created an entire population of transient workers. To ensure that these workers did not become public charges, many communities adopted a warning out system. Poverty was a growing problem in the 18th century cities. In some towns, they did provide relief to residents in the form of food and clothing. Many towns appointed overseers of the poor. By 1750, every seaport city had an almshouse or a workhouse designed to teach the poor proper work habits by having them earn their room and board. Efforts at relief, however, generally fell short. The majority of colonists, they lived in rural areas where the family remained the central unit of economic activity. Farm families participated in commercial networks by selling farm produce of all kinds in order to buy sugar, tea, and other imported items. Communities that had once been largely rural became commercial centers in the 18th century. We see a sharp increase in population left many farm families unable to provide land for their children, and as a result, increased migration to the frontier occurred. While most former indentured servants in the 17th century became landowners, by the 18th century, only 2 out of every 10 former servants were likely to secure land. The population of the Middle Atlantic colonies grew to 250,000 by 1750. Wheat prices had skyrocketed in Europe, and thousands of new European immigrants hoping to take advantage of the boon flooded into Pennsylvania, New York, and the backcountry of Virginia. The Germans and the Scot-Irish created self-contained communities throughout the Middle Atlantic. Immigrants could acquire land more readily in the South, but their economic prospects were increasingly limited by slavery. The planter merchant elite, who benefited from controlled slave labor, also controlled all elements of colonial economic and political life, making less elite families dependent on planters and merchants for military protection and trade. The use of slaves gradually grew more prevalent in the Chesapeake after 1676, but the Carolinas developed as a slave society from the very beginning. Dependence on slave labor made possible the production of large-scale labor-intensive cash crops, enriching merchants and planters, but Southern elites were also more dependent on the global economy. As a result, the prospects of non-slave-holding whites and free blacks were also severely limited. Beginning in the 1660s, assemblies in Virginia and Maryland rigorously defined slavery and further restricted the movement and behavior of slaves. Masters were allowed to kill disobedient slaves with impunity. Slaves were prohibited from carrying weapons, and conversion to Christianity was removed as a reason for manumission, or freeing of your slaves. As slavery grew due to the increasing number of African slaves imported by the Royal African Company, the number of free blacks continued to decline. Only 5% of the 150,000 blacks in the Chesapeake in 1750 were free. More men were imported than women, further skewing a sexual ratio that was beginning to produce some semblance of family life and slowing the production of children. These brutal conditions sparked slave resistance, causing fearful whites to impose stricter regulations. The regulations further separated enslaved blacks and white indentured servants. Because many settlers came from Barbados, the practice of the British West Indies shaped the slave society that developed in the Carolinas. Although slaves were initially used to help with livestock, their skills in rice cultivation made them more valuable as plantation owners recognized the potential of rice as a major export crop. Just to kind of give you a visual of the diverse population, or somewhat diverse population, of the colonies, here we can see the predominant ethnic groups. Pay attention to like South Carolina and also in Virginia. Look at all the Africans. A little bit of blue. Dutch are still remaining in some areas. English and Welsh, it's going to make, I mean, they're the English colonies, it kind of makes sense. Some Germans, Scot-Irish, Scots, really there in the Carolinas, and then Swedish. Carolina plantation owners were not as severe with their slaves as were their Virginia counterparts because they needed the skilled labor of slaves as well as their help in thwarting attacks by Indians and the Spanish. Moreover, Carolina slaveholders were frequently absentee landowners, a situation that allowed slaves greater autonomy. As rice became a more valuable crop, however, slaves were treated more harshly and were controlled more completely. By 1720, blacks outnumbered whites in the Carolinas, and slave owners became more afraid of slave revolts. They were outnumbered. Slaves became more repressive and continued to be so as the production of indigo increased. Slave laws became more repressive, and continued to be so as the production of indigo increased the demand for slave labor. By 1750, slaves constituted 60% of South Carolina's population. Just to give you an idea of just the absurdity of slavery, this is an advertisement for slaves being sold in Charleston, South Carolina. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with kind of, this is an S. So I'll read it to you. To be sold on board the ship, and I cannot make out the name of that ship right now, on Tuesday the 6th of May, next at Ashley Ferry, a choice cargo of about 250 fine, healthy Negroes just arrived from the Windward and Rice Coast. The utmost care has already been taken and shall be continued to keep them free from the least danger of being infected with smallpox. No boat having been on board, and all other communication with people from Charlestown prevented. Full one half of the above Negroes have had smallpox in their own country, so now they have an immunity is what they're trying to tell you. But I mean, just kind of, I don't know, it should make you shake your head at least just reading these adverts. Slaves resisted their enslavement, right? I mean, we're going to see different forms of resistance. Mostly it's nonviolent ways, such as pretending to be sick or refusing to work. Some are going to engage in violent revolts, though. The punishment for slave revolts, it ranged anywhere from a whipping and mutilation to execution. As whites became more paranoid about revolts, they became less concerned about whether the slaves being punished were actually guilty. Kind of sounds familiar, huh? Both Southern and Northern whites understood that slaves wanted freedom, and as more slaves came directly from Africa, rebellions, both real and imagined, increased. A 1712 slave revolt in New York resulted in the death of 8 whites and the subsequent execution of 18 slave insurgents. In 1741, suspicious fires in New York City and fears and reliance among blacks and working class whites led authorities to execute 34 people, including 4 whites. 72 blacks were banished from the city. The most serious slave revolt of the colonial era occurred in South Carolina in 1739. After stealing weapons from a store and killing the store owners, a group of slaves marched south along the Stono River, killing whites and encouraging other slaves to join them. The rebels were eventually surrounded, and many of them died in the ensuing battle or were captured and executed shortly after. The Stono Rebellion occurred against the backdrop of increased tensions between Spanish Florida and the English colonies and a high importation of African slaves. Spanish authorities promised freedom to escaped slaves in 1738, formed a black militia company. The outbreak of war in 1739 may have further encouraged the Stono rebels. So kind of think of that for a second. Like Spanish Florida is encouraging, like, hey, if you can make it down into our territory, we'll grant you freedom. And that's going to entice a lot of slaves as they hear this news and that rumor and kind of starts to spread. More and more are going to be looking for opportunities to leave slavery and get down into Florida. Even if they have to join the military in order to be free, they'll serve their time with a promise of freedom at the end of that service. Just to also, this is enslaved blacks working on tobacco plantation. This is about 1750. And you can tell, I mean, just look at even the clothing, the difference, the stark difference between the whites and the slaves. So as we move forward, we're going to talk a lot about slavery. We're going to talk more about slave resistance. We're going to talk, as we're going to talk about slaves' participation in the revolution, and especially those chances of freedom that came with these different wars that are going to pop up before the revolution.